Dr. Elena Vasquez thought she was just another lab technician running routine DNA tests at the Centers for Disease Control, but when her own genetic sample accidentally got mixed into a batch of evidence from the world's most devastating bioweapon attack, the results would shatter everything she believed about herself. The computer screen showed a 99.7% genetic match to Dr. Viktor Markov, the notorious scientist who had unleashed a supervirus that killed millions before vanishing without a trace 15 years ago. Elena stared at the impossible data, her hands trembling as she realized she might be the daughter of the world's most wanted bioterrorist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Laboratory B7 hummed overhead as Elena rubbed her tired eyes trying to process what she was seeing on her computer monitor. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the CDC building was nearly empty except for the night security guards and a few dedicated researchers like herself who often worked late into the evening. The lab's silence was broken only by the gentle whir of centrifuges and the occasional beep from automated equipment running overnight protocols. Elena had been working at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for 3 years now, ever since completing her doctoral thesis on viral genetic sequencing at MIT. Her colleagues respected her meticulous attention to detail and her almost supernatural ability to spot genetic anomalies that others missed. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lab director, often joked that Elena could speak virus better than most people could speak their native language. But Elena had always attributed her skills to hard work and natural scientific curiosity, never questioning why viral genetics seemed to come so naturally to her. Tonight's assignment had been routine, at least by CDC standards. She was processing genetic evidence from a 15-year-old cold case involving the Markov strain, an engineered supervirus that had devastated Eastern Europe in 2009. The bioweapon had been sophisticated beyond anything the scientific community had ever seen, targeting specific genetic markers while remaining dormant for months before activation. It had killed 3.2 million people across 6 countries before international efforts finally contained the outbreak. The virus's creator, Dr. Viktor Markov, had vanished without a trace just days before the first cases appeared, leaving behind only scattered research notes and a global manhunt that continued to this day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The case had been reopened recently due to new evidence suggesting that Markov might still be alive and potentially developing new biological weapons. Elena's job was to analyze genetic samples from suspected Markov laboratories that had been raided by international authorities, looking for any clues that might help track down the elusive scientist. It was painstaking work comparing viral genetic sequences against known Markov signatures and cross-referencing them with global databases. Elena had been working through the evening, methodically processing sample after sample when she decided to take a break and finally submit her own DNA to the lab's ancestry database. It was something she had been putting off for months, mainly because she wasn't sure she was ready to learn about her unknown past. As an orphan who had grown up in the foster care system, Elena had always wondered about her biological parents, but she had also learned to protect herself from disappointment by not hoping for too much. The Ancestry database was a legitimate scientific tool that the CDC used to help identify victims of biological attacks and trace genetic markers across populations. Employees were encouraged to contribute their own genetic profiles to help expand the reference database, and Elena had finally decided it was time to satisfy her curiosity about her heritage. She carefully prepared her saliva sample following the same protocols she used for evidence processing and labeled it with what she thought was a unique identifier code. But in her exhaustion from working a 14-hour day, Elena made a critical mistake. She accidentally used the same batch number that she had been assigned for the Markov evidence samples. The automated laboratory system, designed to be absolutely precise in its processing, treated Elena's personal DNA sample as part of the official investigation. When the genetic analysis completed several hours later, the computer automatically ran comparisons between Elena's DNA and all known genetic profiles related to the Markov case. The results appeared on Elena's screen just as she was preparing to leave for the night. At first she assumed it was a computer error, or a mislabeled sample. The system was showing a 99.7% genetic match between her DNA and a reference sample from Dr. Viktor Markov himself, a sample that had been collected from his abandoned laboratory 15 years earlier. Elena's rational mind immediately rejected the possibility. Computer systems made mistakes all the time, especially when processing large batches of data. She would simply rerun the analysis in the morning and correct whatever error had occurred. But as Elena stared at the screen, something deep in her subconscious began to stir. She thought about her uncanny ability to understand viral behavior, her intuitive grasp of genetic engineering principles, and the way she sometimes seemed to anticipate how viruses would mutate before the data confirmed her predictions. Her colleagues had always praised these skills, but Elena had never questioned where they came from. Now, looking at the impossible results on her computer screen, she began to wonder if her scientific gifts might be more than just natural talent. Elena's hands shook as she ran the genetic comparison again, this time triple-checking every parameter and control. The results came back identical, 99.7% match. She ran it a third time, then a fourth, each time hoping the numbers would change, that the computer would reveal its error and return her world to normal. But the genetic markers were unmistakable, the probability calculations were precise, and the match was far too strong to be coincidental. As the implications began to sink in, Elena felt her carefully ordered world starting to collapse around her. If the results were accurate, then she wasn't just any orphan who had made good through hard work and determination. She was the daughter of the most wanted bioterrorist in history, a man whose creations had caused more death and suffering than most natural disasters. The thought was so overwhelming that Elena had to grip the edge of her desk to steady herself. She looked around the empty laboratory, at the equipment she had used for 3 years, at the CDC identification badge hanging around her neck, at the framed photo of her receiving her doctoral degree. Everything that defined Elena Vasquez, respected scientist and dedicated public servant, suddenly felt like an elaborate lie. If Viktor Markov was truly her father, then what did that make her? And more terrifyingly, who else might already know the truth? Elena had grown up believing she was nobody special, just another forgotten child in an overwhelmed foster care system that processed thousands of orphans every year. Her earliest memories were of St. Catherine's Children's Home in Portland, Oregon, a sprawling brick building that housed 43 children ranging in age from infants to teenagers. Sister Margaret, the elderly nun who ran the facility, had told Elena that she had been found as a toddler in a bus station in Seattle, clutching a small stuffed rabbit and a handwritten note that simply read, "Please take care of Elena. She deserves better than I can give her." The note had been written in careful cursive handwriting, but there had been no signature, no return address, and no other clues about Elena's origins. The police investigation had turned up nothing, and after 6 months in the system, Elena had been officially declared an orphan and made available for adoption. But potential parents seemed to pass her by, perhaps sensing something unusual about the quiet, intense little girl who seemed more interested in examining insects and asking complex questions about why things worked the way they did. Sister Margaret had recognized Elena's intellectual gifts early on. While other children her age were playing with dolls or building blocks, Elena was teaching herself to read using scientific magazines that visitors left behind in the home's waiting room. By age 7, she was reading at a high school level and asking questions about genetics and molecular biology that even the home's part-time tutor couldn't answer. The nuns had arranged for Elena to skip 2 grades, and by the time she was 14 she was taking advanced placement courses at the local community college. Despite her academic success, Elena's childhood had been marked by a persistent sense of not quite fitting in anywhere. She was too young to relate to her college classmates, and too intellectually advanced to connect with children her own age at St. Catherine's. She found solace in books and scientific journals, spending hours in the Portland Public Library, reading about virology, genetics and biochemistry. The librarians had grown accustomed to the serious teenager who checked out graduate-level textbooks and returned completely absorbed and annotated with detailed notes in the margins. Elena's breakthrough had come during her senior year of high school, when she entered a statewide science fair with a project on viral mutation patterns. Her research had been so sophisticated that Dr. James Wilson, a visiting professor from MIT, had approached her after her presentation to ask if she was planning to pursue graduate studies in virology. When Elena explained that she was only 17 and still finishing high school, Dr. Wilson had been amazed. He arranged for Elena to apply for early admission to MIT with a full scholarship, an opportunity that would change the trajectory of her entire life. The transition to MIT had been both exhilarating and overwhelming. Elena found herself surrounded by some of the brightest minds in the country, students who had attended elite preparatory schools and grown up in academically stimulating environments that she could barely imagine. But while her classmates had advantages in terms of resources and connections, Elena had something else, an almost intuitive understanding of how biological systems worked at the molecular level. Her professors had been consistently impressed by Elena's ability to predict viral behavior and genetic interactions without relying heavily on computational models. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, her thesis advisor, had often remarked that Elena seemed to think like a virus, understanding instinctively how genetic changes would affect protein folding, replication rates, and host interactions. Other students needed complex simulations and extensive laboratory testing to reach conclusions that Elena could often predict just by examining genetic sequences. Elena's doctoral thesis had focused on developing new methods for tracking viral evolution in real time, work that had potential applications for both disease prevention and biodefense. Her research had been so innovative that it had attracted attention from government agencies, including the CDC, which had offered her a position immediately upon graduation. The job offer had felt like validation of everything Elena had worked for, proof that a forgotten orphan from Portland could make meaningful contributions to public health and scientific knowledge. Her first 3 years at the CDC had been everything Elena had hoped for professionally. She worked with cutting-edge technology, collaborated with world-renowned scientists, and contributed to research that could potentially save millions of lives. Her colleagues respected her expertise and dedication, and Dr. Sarah Chen had hinted that Elena was being considered for promotion to senior researcher, a position that would give her more independence and access to classified projects. Personally, however, Elena's life remained relatively isolated. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, close enough to the CDC that she could walk to work when the weather was nice. Her social life consisted mainly of occasional dinners with colleagues and attendance at scientific conferences where she could network with other researchers in her field. She had tried dating a few times, but her intense focus on work and her tendency to discuss viral genetics over dinner had proven off-putting to most potential partners. Elena had always told herself that her solitary lifestyle was a choice, that she was simply too focused on her career to invest time in relationships or social activities. But privately she sometimes wondered if her isolation was connected to her unknown origins. Without a family history or cultural background to ground her identity, Elena often felt like she was floating through life without deep connections to anything or anyone. Her apartment reflected this sense of impermanence. The walls were bare except for a few scientific awards and her framed doctoral diploma. Her furniture was functional but impersonal, the kind of pieces that could be easily replaced or left behind if she needed to move suddenly. The only personal items Elena treasured were the few belongings that had been found with her as a child: the small stuffed rabbit, now worn and faded, a silver locket that contained no photographs, and a children's book about marine biology that someone had apparently read to her many times. Elena had occasionally considered using genetic testing services to search for biological relatives, but she had always hesitated. Part of her feared disappointment, the possibility that her parents had simply abandoned her and moved on with their lives. But another part of her worried about what she might discover. Her unusual scientific abilities and intuitive understanding of viral behavior sometimes made her wonder if there was something different about her genetic makeup, something that might be better left unexplored. As she sat in the empty CDC laboratory at nearly midnight, staring at the impossible genetic match results on her computer screen, Elena realized that her quiet, carefully controlled life was about to change forever. The truth about her origins, which she had spent years avoiding, was now demanding her attention in the most dramatic way possible. And as she began to process the implications of being genetically related to one of history's most dangerous bioterrorists, Elena couldn't help but wonder if her years of isolation and emotional distance had been preparation for this moment, when everything she believed about herself would be stripped away and rebuilt from the ground up. The mistake that would change Elena's life forever began during one of the most stressful weeks of her career at the CDC. It was the third week of November, and the laboratory was processing an unusually large backlog of samples due to a suspected bioterrorism incident in Eastern Europe. Intelligence agencies had raided several abandoned facilities in Romania and Bulgaria that showed signs of recent biological research activity, and the recovered materials had been shipped to Atlanta for analysis. Elena had been working 12-hour days for the past 2 weeks, carefully cataloging and testing genetic samples that might provide clues about whether Dr. Viktor Markov was still active in biological weapons development. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining, partly because Elena had to constantly review files and photographs related to the devastating 2009 Markov strain outbreak. Each time she looked at the mortality statistics and victim photographs, she was reminded of why her work was so important, and why finding Markov remained a top priority for international security agencies. The samples from the Romanian raid were particularly challenging to process because they had been contaminated by exposure to the elements and required extensive purification before genetic analysis could begin. Elena had spent hours each day working with delicate equipment to extract usable DNA from degraded biological materials, a process that required absolute precision and focus. By Thursday of that week, she was operating on less than 5 hours of sleep per night, and surviving primarily on caffeine and determination. It was during her lunch break on Thursday that Elena finally decided to submit her personal DNA sample to the lab's ancestry database. She had been carrying the sample collection kit in her desk drawer for over 3 months, ever since Dr. Chen had distributed them to all laboratory personnel as part of an initiative to expand the CDC's genetic reference database. The database was used for legitimate scientific purposes, helping researchers understand genetic variations across different populations and assisting in the identification of victims from biological attacks or natural disasters. Elena had procrastinated on submitting her sample partly because she wasn't sure she was ready to learn about her genetic heritage, and partly because she had been too busy with work to think about personal matters. But sitting in the empty break room, eating a sandwich while reviewing case files, she suddenly felt compelled to satisfy her curiosity about her biological background. Perhaps it was the stress of working on the Markov case, or perhaps it was simply time to confront the questions about her past that she had been avoiding for years. The sample collection process was straightforward, involving a simple saliva test that Elena had performed hundreds of times for other people. She carefully followed the protocols, ensuring that the sample was properly preserved, and that all contamination safeguards were in place. The kit included a barcode label that needed to be attached to the sample container, linking it to Elena's personal information in the database system. However, Elena made a critical error in her exhausted state. Instead of using the unique identifier code that had been assigned to her personal sample, she accidentally wrote down the batch number that she had been using all week for the Markov evidence samples. The codes were similar in format, and in her fatigue, Elena's muscle memory took over as she labeled the container with the familiar number sequence that she had been writing on evidence labels for days. The automated laboratory system that processed genetic samples was designed to be absolutely precise and objective. When Elena's sample entered the analysis kit later that afternoon, the computer system read the batch number and automatically categorized it as part of the ongoing Markov investigation. The system had been programmed to run comprehensive comparisons between any new samples in the Markov batch and all existing genetic profiles related to the case, including reference samples that had been collected from Viktor Markov's abandoned laboratories 15 years earlier. Elena had returned to her regular work after submitting the sample, diving back into the tedious process of analyzing degraded genetic material from the Romanian right. She was focused on trying to determine whether any of the recovered samples contained genetic signatures consistent with Markov's known bioweapon designs. The work required her full attention, and she needed to distinguish between natural genetic variations and artificial modifications that might indicate human engineering. As the afternoon progressed, Elena became increasingly absorbed in a particularly challenging sample that seemed to contain fragments of an unknown viral genome. The genetic sequence had several unusual characteristics that reminded her of patterns she had seen in historical Markov strain samples, but the degradation made it difficult to be certain. She spent hours carefully reconstructing partial genetic sequences, cross-referencing them against known databases, and running statistical analyses to determine the probability that the sample represented a new Markov bioweapon. The laboratory's automated systems continued running throughout the evening, processing not only Elena's mysterious viral sample, but also the personal DNA sample she had submitted earlier. The genetic analysis equipment worked through the night, breaking down cellular material, amplifying DNA sequences, and comparing genetic markers against reference databases. The computer systems were designed to work independently, allowing researchers to submit samples at any time and retrieve results when the analysis was complete. Elena had stayed late that night, determined to make progress on the challenging viral sample before going home. She was particularly frustrated because the genetic patterns seemed familiar to her in a way that she couldn't quite explain. There was something about the viral structure that felt almost intuitive to her, as if she could predict how the incomplete sequences should continue even without complete data. Her colleagues had often remarked on this ability, joking that Elena had a sixth sense for viral genetics, but she had always attributed it to experience and careful study. It was nearly midnight when Elena finally decided to check whether her personal ancestry results had finished processing. She was curious to see what the genetic analysis might reveal about her ethnic background, and whether it might provide any clues about her biological parents' origins. She had been particularly interested in learning whether her genetic profile showed markers consistent with Eastern European ancestry, partly because of her work on the Markov case, and partly because she had always felt drawn to studying biological research from that region. When Elena accessed the results database and saw the genetic comparison report waiting for her review, she initially assumed that the system had made an error. The report showed a 99.7% genetic match between her DNA sample and a reference profile labeled Markov victim primary subject. Elena's rational mind immediately rejected the possibility that the results could be accurate. Genetic databases were complex systems that processed thousands of samples, and occasional errors were inevitable, especially when dealing with large batches of evidence. Elena's first instinct was to simply delete the results and resubmit her sample with the correct identifier code. But something made her pause and look more carefully at the genetic comparison data. The match wasn't just strong, it was remarkably comprehensive, covering multiple chromosomal regions, and including rare genetic markers that would be extremely unlikely to match by coincidence. The statistical probability that such a close genetic relationship could occur randomly was less than 1 in several billion. As Elena stared at the impossible results on her computer screen, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. She thought about her mysterious visits at the Seattle bus station as a toddler, her unknown parentage, and the timeline that would place her birth around the same period when Viktor Markov had been working on his most dangerous biological weapons projects. The possibility that she might be related to one of history's most notorious terrorists was almost too overwhelming to contemplate, but the genetic evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Elena decided to run the genetic comparison analysis again, this time using manual parameters to ensure that every aspect of the process was properly controlled.
She wanted to eliminate any possibility of computer error or data contamination before drawing any conclusions about what the results might mean. But as she prepared to rerun the test, Elena couldn't shake the growing suspicion that her carefully ordered world was about to be turned completely upside down.
Elena's first instinct after seeing the genetic match results was to convince herself that the computer system had made a catastrophic error. She spent the next 2 hours meticulously checking every aspect of the analysis, examining the raw genetic data, verifying the reference sequences, and running multiple statistical models to calculate the probability of a false positive match. But no matter how many times she reran the comparisons or adjusted the parameters, the results remained consistent. Her DNA showed a 99.7% genetic match to Viktor Markov, indicating a parent-child relationship with near certainty. As dawn broke over Atlanta and the early morning shift began arriving at the CDC, Elena realized she needed to make a decision about what to do with her discovery. Her scientific training demanded that she report any significant findings related to the Markov investigation, but her personal survival instincts warned her that revealing her genetic connection to the world's most wanted bioterrorist could destroy her career and possibly put her life in danger. Instead, she chose a middle path. She would conduct her own private investigation to understand what the genetic match might mean and whether there could be any innocent explanation for the connection. Elena began her research by accessing the classified files related to Viktor Markov's background and criminal activities. As a CDC researcher working on biodefense projects, she had security clearance that allowed her to review detailed intelligence reports about known biological weapons developers. She had studied some of these files before as part of her regular work, but now she examined them with a new sense of urgency and personal interest, looking for any clues that might explain her genetic connection to Markov. The official intelligence dossier painted a picture of a brilliant but deeply disturbed scientist who had dedicated his career to developing biological weapons capable of mass destruction. Viktor Markov had been born in 1965 in Novosibirsk, Russia, where his father had worked as a researcher at a Soviet biological weapons facility. Markov had shown exceptional aptitude for genetics and microbiology from an early age, earning admission to Moscow State University at age 16 and completing his doctoral studies in virology by age 22. During the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and many biological weapons programs were officially discontinued, Markov had worked for various research institutes across Eastern Europe, ostensibly developing defensive vaccines and antiviral medications. However, Western intelligence agencies had suspected him of continuing offensive biological weapons research, possibly selling his expertise to rogue nations and terrorist organizations. In 2003, Markov had defected to the United States, claiming to possess information about Soviet bioweapon stockpiles and offering to help American authorities develop countermeasures against biological attacks. For several years, Markov had worked as a contractor for various U.S. government agencies, including the Department of Defense and the CIA. His official projects involved developing detection systems for biological weapons and creating vaccines against potential bioterror agents. But intelligence reports suggested that Markov had been using his access to classified information and laboratory facilities to continue his own research into offensive biological weapons, possibly with the intention of selling them to the highest bidder. The turning point had come in 2008, when European intelligence agencies had discovered evidence that Markov was secretly developing a sophisticated bioweapon in a private laboratory facility in Bulgaria. The weapon, which would later become known as the Markov strain, was designed to target specific genetic markers found primarily in Slavic populations, while remaining dormant for months before activation. The virus was engineered to spread through respiratory droplets like a common cold, but after an incubation period of 60–90 days, it would activate and cause rapid organ failure in infected individuals. Elena felt sick as she read the technical details of her father's alleged creation. The Markov strain had been a masterpiece of biological engineering, combining elements of multiple viral families with artificial genetic sequences that had never been seen in nature. The virus had been designed to be virtually undetectable during its dormant phase and nearly impossible to treat once activated. Intelligence reports estimated that Markov had spent over 5 years developing the weapon, testing it on animal subjects and possibly human volunteers in remote locations. The outbreak had begun in March 2009, with the first cases appearing simultaneously in 6 different countries across Eastern Europe. Initial symptoms had resembled seasonal flu, and most patients had recovered completely within a week. It wasn't until 3 months later, when previously healthy individuals began dying of mysterious organ failures, that medical authorities realized they were dealing with an engineered bioweapon. By the time the connection was established, over 100,000 people had been exposed to the virus, and the death toll eventually reached 3.2 million. Viktor Markov had vanished on March 15, 2009, just 3 days after the first Markov strain cases had been reported. His laboratory in Bulgaria had been found completely destroyed, with all research materials either removed or incinerated. International manhunts had been launched across multiple continents, but Markov had seemed to disappear completely, leaving behind no trace of his whereabouts or future plans. Some intelligence reports suggested he had fled to South America, where he might be continuing his biological weapons research under a new identity. As Elena absorbed these horrifying details about her potential father's crimes, she began to understand why her own existence might be considered a security threat. If Viktor Markov had indeed fathered a child, that child could potentially inherit not only his genetic material but also his knowledge and capabilities. Elena's exceptional abilities in viral genetics, which she had always attributed to natural talent and hard work, suddenly took on a more sinister significance. Had her intuitive understanding of viral behavior been inherited from one of history's most dangerous bioterrorists? Elena also began to research the timeline more carefully, trying to understand when and where she might have been conceived. According to the intelligence files, Viktor Markov had been living in the United States between 2003 and 2008, working on various classified projects while secretly developing his bioweapon. Elena had been found as a toddler in Seattle in 2007, which would place her birth around 2005, right in the middle of Markov's time in America. The geographic connection was particularly troubling. While Elena had grown up believing she had been found in Seattle, her CDC personnel file contained discrepancies that suggested the official story might not be complete. There were medical records from her early childhood that indicated she had been treated at hospitals in both Seattle and Portland, as well as references to temporary foster placements that didn't match her memories of growing up at St. Catherine's Children's Home. Elena realized that someone had gone to considerable effort to obscure the details of her early life, possibly to protect her from people who might want to use her connection to Viktor Markov for their own purposes. But the careful construction of her false backstory also raised disturbing questions about who had been watching her and what they might want from her now that she had discovered the truth about her parentage. As Elena delved deeper into the classified files, she began to notice patterns that suggested she might not be the only person who knew about her genetic connection to Markov. There were references to ongoing surveillance operations targeting Markov associates and potential biological descendants, as well as budget allocations for long-term monitoring programs that seemed to extend well beyond the initial investigation into the 2009 outbreak. Elena began to suspect that her hiring at the CDC, her security clearance, and even her assignment to biodefense projects might not have been coincidental. The realization that she might have been under government surveillance for years filled Elena with a mixture of fear and anger. Everything she had achieved in her scientific career, everything she thought she had earned through hard work and dedication, might have been orchestrated by people who saw her not as an individual but as a potential asset or threat related to her father's crimes. As Elena continued her clandestine research into Viktor Markov's background and her own mysterious origins, she began to develop an acute sense of paranoia that affected every aspect of her daily life. The secure environment of the CDC, which had always felt like a sanctuary dedicated to protecting public health, now seemed potentially hostile and filled with hidden surveillance. Every conversation with colleagues became a careful dance of information gathering and misdirection, as Elena tried to learn more about what others might know without revealing her own dangerous discovery. The first sign that Elena might already be under observation came during a routine staff meeting on Friday morning, just 2 days after she had discovered the genetic match. Dr. Sarah Chen, the laboratory director, was discussing recent developments in the Markov investigation when she made an offhand comment about the importance of maintaining security protocols for all personnel working on classified biodefense projects. But as Dr. Chen spoke, Elena noticed that her supervisor seemed to be looking directly at her, with an expression that suggested more than casual concern. Elena began to pay closer attention to the behavior of her colleagues and supervisors, looking for any signs that they might know about her genetic connection to Viktor Markov. She noticed that Dr. Richards, her immediate supervisor, had started checking on her work more frequently than usual, often appearing at her workstation with questions about her progress on various projects. While his inquiries seemed routine on the surface, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that he was monitoring her activities more closely than necessary. The paranoia intensified when Elena discovered that several classified files related to the Markov investigation had been moved or reorganized in the database system. Files that she had accessed earlier in the week were now stored in different locations, and some documents that she remembered reading were no longer available through her security clearance level. When Elena asked the database administrator about the changes, she was told that routine security updates had been implemented to improve system organization, but the explanation felt inadequate and suspicious. Elena also began to notice unusual patterns in her computer access logs. The CDC's security systems tracked every file access and database query made by personnel with classified clearances, and Elena had learned to monitor her own activity logs as part of standard security practices. But now she discovered that her access logs showed queries and file retrievals that she didn't remember making, particularly during evening hours when she was usually at home. Either someone else was using her credentials to access classified information, or the system was being manipulated to obscure the true extent of her research activities. The growing sense of surveillance extended beyond Elena's workplace and into her personal life. She began to notice the same vehicles parked near her apartment building on multiple days, often with occupants who seemed to be reading newspapers or talking on cell phones for unusually long periods. The building's security cameras, which had been broken for months according to the maintenance staff, were suddenly repaired and operational. Elena's mail delivery became irregular, with some letters arriving days late or showing signs of having been opened and resealed. Most disturbing of all were the phone calls. Elena's home phone began receiving calls at odd hours, usually late at night or early in the morning, but when she answered, the caller would hang up immediately. Her cell phone also experienced strange behavior, including sudden battery drain, unexpected reboots, and occasionally picking up fragments of other people's conversations during calls. Elena suspected that her communications were being monitored, but she had no way to prove it without access to sophisticated surveillance detection equipment. The psychological pressure of living under potential surveillance began to take a toll on Elena's work performance and personal well-being. She found herself constantly second-guessing her decisions, wondering whether her actions were being interpreted as suspicious by whoever might be watching her. Simple activities like using the library's internet computers to research her family history or visiting medical offices to request childhood records became elaborate exercises in misdirection and counter-surveillance. Elena's sleep patterns deteriorated as she lay awake at night wondering who might know about her genetic connection to Viktor Markov and what they might be planning to do with that information. She researched cases of other scientists who had been subjected to government surveillance, learning about people who had lost their careers, their families, and sometimes their lives because they possessed knowledge or capabilities that were deemed too dangerous for civilian hands. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of Elena's growing paranoia. She desperately wanted to confide in someone about her discovery, to share the burden of knowledge that was consuming her thoughts and affecting her ability to function normally. But every potential confidant seemed like a security risk. Her colleagues at the CDC were too closely connected to the biodefense establishment to be trustworthy. Her few personal friends outside of work lacked the scientific background to understand the implications of her situation, and reaching out to family members was impossible because she had no family members to contact. Elena began to take precautions that she hoped would protect her from surveillance while allowing her to continue her research. She purchased a used laptop with cash and used it only at public locations with free Wi-Fi, never connecting it to her home internet or bringing it to her workplace. She opened a safety deposit box at a bank across town, where she stored copies of all the genetic analysis data and classified files she had been able to access. She also began varying her daily routines, taking different routes to work, shopping at different stores, and changing her exercise schedule to make it more difficult for anyone to predict her movements. Despite these precautions, Elena couldn't escape the feeling that she was fighting a losing battle against opponents who had vastly superior resources and expertise. If the government had indeed been monitoring her for years, they would have detailed profiles of her habits, relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. They would know about her isolation and her desperate desire to understand her origins, and they might be prepared to exploit those weaknesses if necessary. The stress of maintaining her double life began to affect Elena's work at the CDC. She made small errors in data analysis that she would never have made under normal circumstances. She became withdrawn during team meetings, contributing less to discussions and avoiding opportunities to showcase her expertise. Her colleagues began to notice the changes in her behavior, with Dr. Chen asking several times whether Elena was feeling well or experiencing any personal problems that might be affecting her performance. Elena's paranoia reached a crescendo when she discovered that someone had been in her apartment while she was at work. Nothing had been stolen, and the intrusion had been so subtle that she almost didn't notice it. But Elena had developed habits of precisely arranging her personal belongings, and she could tell that items had been moved slightly and then replaced in approximately their original positions. Her computer showed signs of having been accessed, and she found digital evidence suggesting that someone had copied files from her hard drive. The realization that her most private space had been violated filled Elena with a mixture of terror and rage. She understood that she was now living in a world where her every action was being monitored and analyzed by people who saw her not as a human being with rights and dignity, but as a potential threat or asset to be managed. The quiet life she had built for herself, the career she had worked so hard to establish, and the sense of safety she had always taken for granted were all being systematically dismantled by forces beyond her control. Elena knew that she was approaching a critical decision point. She could try to pretend that nothing had happened, returning to her normal routines and hoping that whoever was watching her would eventually lose interest. But she also knew that the knowledge of her genetic connection to Viktor Markov was too significant to ignore, and that the people monitoring her would never simply allow her to forget what she had discovered. Elena's paranoia reached a breaking point exactly 1 week after her initial discovery, when she decided to access her own personnel file through the CDC's Human Resources database. What she found there shattered the last remnants of her belief that her life had been shaped by chance and merit rather than careful manipulation. The file contained documents and medical records that contradicted nearly everything she thought she knew about her childhood and background, revealing a level of deception and surveillance that extended back to her earliest years. According to the official CDC records, Elena Vasquez had been born in Spokane, Washington, not found as an abandoned toddler in Seattle as she had always believed. The file contained birth certificates, medical records, and social security documentation that painted a completely different picture of her origins. More disturbing still were the psychological evaluations and genetic predisposition assessments that had apparently been conducted when she was a child, documents that suggested someone had been monitoring her development and capabilities from a very early age. The medical records were particularly revealing. They showed that Elena had undergone extensive genetic testing as a young child, far beyond what would be normal for a typical orphan entering the foster care system. The tests had analyzed not only her general health and hereditary disease risks, but also specific genetic markers related to intelligence, psychological stability, and biological research aptitude. Someone had been very interested in understanding Elena's inherited capability, and they had been tracking her development with scientific precision. Elena also discovered that her educational path had been far less random than she had believed. The scholarship to MIT, which she had always considered the lucky break that made her career possible, had apparently been arranged through a private foundation with connections to various government agencies. her acceptance into the CDC's graduate internship program, her security clearance approval, and even her assignment to specific biodefense projects had all been facilitated by people who had been monitoring her progress for years. Most shocking of all was a psychological profile that had been updated regularly throughout Elena's academic and professional career. The document analyzed her personality traits, emotional stability, interpersonal relationships, and potential responses to various scenarios, including revelation of true parentage and exposure to classified information regarding biological family. Elena realized that every major decision in her life had been predicted and planned for by people who understood her psychology better than she understood it herself. The personnel file also contained references to something called Operation Bloodline, a classified program that appeared to be related to monitoring the relatives and potential descendants of known biological weapons developers. Elena's name appeared on a list of persons of interest that included several other individuals with connections to various bioterrorists and rogue scientists. The program seemed to involve long-term surveillance and assessment of these individuals, with the apparent goal of determining whether they pose security risks or might be useful as intelligence. As Elena absorbed the implications of what she had discovered, she realized that her entire life had been an elaborate government experiment. She had never been a normal orphan who succeeded through hard work and talent. She had been a monitored subject whose every move had been observed and analyzed by people trying to understand whether Viktor Markov's genetic legacy posed a threat to national security. Her career at the CDC hadn't been earned through merit. It had been a controlled environment where her capabilities could be studied and her loyalty could be tested. The revelation filled Elena with a mixture of rage and despair that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Everything she had accomplished, every relationship she had formed, every decision she had made had been influenced by forces she hadn't even known existed. The loneliness and isolation that had characterized her life suddenly made sense in a horrible way. She had been kept out. Relationships might have complicated the surveillance operation or provided her with emotional support that could make her less controllable. Elena began to understand that her discovery of the genetic match hadn't been an accident at all. The mislabeling of her DNA sample had been too convenient, too perfectly timed to be mere coincidence. Someone had wanted her to learn of her connection to Viktor Markov, possibly to observe her reaction, or to prepare her for some role in a larger operation. Elena realized that she was trapped in a situation where even her own thoughts and emotions were being manipulated by people who had been studying her psychological profile for decades. The stress of these realizations began to affect Elena's behavior in ways that she knew would be noticed by her supervisors. She became increasingly withdrawn at work, avoiding casual conversations with colleagues and spending long periods staring at her computer screen without accomplishing any meaningful tasks. Her concentration was shattered, and she found herself unable to focus on complex genetic analyses that had once been routine for her. She made several minor errors in her work that would normally have been unthinkable for someone of her experience and expertise. Elena also began exhibiting subtle signs of paranoid behavior that she knew would be documented in her surveillance reports. She started checking over her shoulder frequently, varying her routes through the CDC building, and testing whether doors that should be locked were actually secure. She began leaving small indicators in her workspace to detect whether anyone had been searching through her materials, and she started taking photographs of her computer screen to document what files she had been working on. Dr. Richards, Elena's immediate supervisor, seemed to be paying increasingly close attention to her behavior and work performance. He began stopping by her workstation more frequently, ostensibly to check on her progress with various projects, but clearly observing her emotional state and stress levels. Elena noticed that these visits often occurred after she had experienced particularly difficult moments, such as when she discovered new information about her background, or when she felt overwhelmed by the implications of her situation. The surveillance became so obvious that Elena began to suspect it was intentional, designed to increase her stress levels and push her towards some kind of breaking point.
She realized that her handlers might be waiting for her to either completely break down, attempt to flee, or try to contact her father directly. Each of these responses would provide them with valuable information about her psychological makeup and potential utility as an intelligence asset. Elena understood that she was approaching a critical decision point where she would have to choose between several equally dangerous options. She could try to confront her supervisors directly about what she had discovered, but that would likely result in her immediate detention and possible disappearance into some classified government program. She could attempt to flee the country and try to find Viktor Markov herself, but that would make her a fugitive and potentially confirm any suspicions about her loyalty to American interests. Alternatively, she could try to play along with whatever game was being orchestrated around her, pretending to be unaware of the surveillance while trying to gather more information about her father's location and activities. But Elena knew that her psychological profile would make it difficult for her to maintain such deception for very long, and her handlers would likely detect any attempt at counter-manipulation. As Elena sat in the empty CDC laboratory late on Friday evening, exactly 1 week after her life-changing discovery, she realized that someone was going to force the issue soon. The level of surveillance and psychological pressure being applied to her was unsustainable, and her declining work performance was providing the perfect excuse for her supervisors to intervene more directly. Elena sensed that a confrontation was imminent, and she began to prepare herself mentally for whatever results or demands might be coming her way. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her laboratory interrupted Elena's thoughts, and she looked up to see Dr. Richards approaching her workstation, but something was different about his usual professional demeanor, and Elena could tell from his expression that the careful pretense of normal supervisor-employee relations was about to be abandoned. The moment of truth that she had been dreading and anticipating was finally at hand.
Dr. Richards closed the laboratory door behind him with deliberate care, turning the lock with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty room. Elena felt her heart rate accelerate as she realized that this conversation would be fundamentally different from any interaction she had ever had with her supervisor. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his face as he pulled up a chair and sat down directly across from her workstation, abandoning the usual professional distance that characterized their working relationship. "Elena," Dr. Richards began, his voice carrying a tone of weary resignation that she had never heard before. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who you really are and why you're here at the CDC." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made it clear this was not a discussion she could avoid or deflect with her usual professional composure. "You've discovered something about your background this week, haven't you? Something that's been causing you considerable distress and affecting your work performance." Elena's initial instinct was to deny everything, to maintain the pretense that nothing had changed and that she was simply experiencing work-related stress. But as she looked at Dr. Richards' face, she realized that any attempt at deception would be futile. He already knew exactly what she had discovered, and he had probably been waiting for this moment since she first started working at the CDC 3 years ago. "You know about the genetic match," Elena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact that felt like admitting defeat in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. "You've known all along, haven't you? About Viktor Markov, about my connection to him, about everything." Dr. Richards nodded slowly, his expression mixing professional sympathy with the cold calculation of someone who had been managing a complex intelligence operation for years. "My real name is Agent Michael Chen, and I work for a joint task force that includes personnel from the FBI, CIA, and Department of Homeland Security. I've been assigned to monitor your development and activities since you graduated from MIT, although our awareness of your existence goes back much further than that." Elena felt the last foundations of her carefully constructed reality crumbling around her as Agent Chen began to explain the true nature of her situation. According to his account, the U.S. government had been aware of her genetic connection to Viktor Markov since she was 7 years old, when a routine genetic screening of children in the foster care system had flagged her DNA as being related to a person of interest in national security investigations. Your mother was Dr. Catherine Reeves, Agent Chen continued, pulling out a classified file that contained photographs and documents Elena had never seen before. She was a brilliant biochemist who worked as a research assistant on various government projects in the early 2000s. Unfortunately, she also became romantically involved with Viktor Markov during a period when he was working as a contractor for U.S. biological defense programs. Elena stared at the photographs of a woman who shared her facial features and build, a woman who looked intelligent and determined but also somehow haunted by knowledge that she couldn't share with anyone. Catherine Reeves had been 28 years old when she became pregnant with Elena, and according to the file she had initially believed that Viktor Markov was a legitimate scientist working to protect America from biological weapons threats. Your mother discovered the truth about Markov's activities in late 2004, when she found evidence that he was using his legitimate research as cover for developing offensive biological weapons, Agent Chen explained. She tried to report him to authorities, but Markov had cultivated relationships with people at very high levels of government. When it became clear that her warnings weren't being taken seriously, she went into hiding to protect both herself and you. The story that emerged from the classified files was one of tragedy and heroism that Elena could never have imagined. Catherine Reeves had spent 2 years living under false identities, moving from city to city while trying to document evidence of Markov's illegal activities and gather proof that could be used to stop him. She had given birth to Elena in a private clinic in Oregon, using forged documents to avoid creating any official records that could be traced back to Viktor Markov. Your mother was killed in what appeared to be a car accident when you were 2 years old, Agent Chen said, his voice softening as he delivered the most painful part of the revelation. But we have reason to believe that Viktor Markov had discovered her location and arranged for her elimination to prevent her from exposing his biological weapons program. She died protecting secrets that could have saved millions of lives if the right people had listened to her warnings. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the magnitude of her mother's sacrifice and the horrible irony that Catherine Reeves' warnings about Viktor Markov had ultimately been proven correct by the devastating 2009 outbreak. Her mother had died trying to prevent exactly the kind of biological weapons attack that would eventually kill over 3 million people, and her warnings had been ignored by the same government agencies that were now using Elena as part of their efforts to track down her father. After your mother's death, we faced a difficult decision about what to do with you, Agent Chen continued. You were obviously an innocent child who bore no responsibility for your father's crimes, but you also represented a potential security risk because of your genetic heritage and the possibility that you might inherit Viktor Markov's scientific capabilities. We decided to place you in a carefully monitored environment where you could grow up normally while we assessed your development and potential. Elena realized that her entire childhood and adolescence had been an elaborate experiment designed to determine whether she would follow in her father's footsteps or use her inherited abilities for legitimate purposes. Every teacher who had encouraged her scientific interests, every scholarship that had made her education possible, and every career opportunity that had advanced her professional development had been arranged by people who were studying her psychological and intellectual evolution. The placement at St. Catherine's Children's Home, the scholarship to MIT, your acceptance into our graduate program, and your hiring at the CDC were all part of a long-term assessment protocol, Agent Chen admitted. We needed to understand whether you posed a security threat or whether you might be valuable as an asset in our efforts to counter biological weapons threats. Elena's scientific training had taught her to approach problems objectively and logically, but the emotional impact of learning that her entire life had been a government experiment was overwhelming. She felt simultaneously furious at being manipulated and grateful that she had been given opportunities to develop her capabilities in positive directions. The conflict between these emotions left her feeling disoriented and uncertain about how to respond to Agent Chen's revelations. What happens now? Elena asked, trying to regain some sense of control over her situation. Now that I know the truth about my background and your monitoring operation, what do you expect from me? Am I supposed to continue pretending that everything is normal, or do you have other plans for how to use me in your intelligence operations? Agent Chen's expression became more serious as he prepared to explain the real reason for their conversation. We believe that Viktor Markov is planning another biological weapons attack, possibly even more devastating than the 2009 outbreak. Our intelligence indicates that he's been developing new viral strains that could potentially kill hundreds of millions of people if deployed effectively. Traditional intelligence gathering methods have failed to locate him or penetrate his current operation. Elena began to understand why her handlers had finally decided to reveal the truth about her background and their surveillance operation. They needed her help to find Viktor Markov, and they believed that her genetic connection to him might provide insights or advantages that no other intelligence asset could offer. The revelation of her true parentage wasn't just about honesty or closure, it was about recruiting her for what might be the most dangerous mission in the history of biological warfare prevention. "We think you might be our best hope for stopping him," Agent Chen said quietly. "Your genetic heritage gives you unique insights into how Viktor Markov thinks and approaches biological research. Your scientific training makes you capable of understanding his work at a level that most intelligence operatives couldn't achieve. And your personal connection to him might provide opportunities for contact or infiltration that wouldn't be available to anyone else." Elena realized that she was being asked to hunt down her own father, a man whose scientific legacy had shaped her entire life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The choice before her was both simple and impossible. She could help prevent another biological weapons attack that might kill millions of innocent people, but doing so would require her to betray the only blood relative she had ever known, even if that relative was one of history's most dangerous criminals. Agent Chen leaned back in his chair, allowing Elena time to process the overwhelming revelations about her parentage, her mother's heroic sacrifice, and the government's long-term surveillance operation that had shaped every aspect of her life. The silence in the laboratory stretched for several minutes as Elena stared at the classified files spread across her workstation. Photographs of her mother mixed with intelligence reports about Viktor Markov's biological weapons research and the devastating 2009 outbreak that had killed over 3 million people. "I need you to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with," Agent Chen said finally, pulling out additional classified documents that contained recent intelligence about Viktor Markov's current activities. "We have credible evidence that your father has been developing biological weapons that make the 2009 Markov strain look like a common cold. Our analysts believe he's working on viral agents that could potentially kill half the world's population if deployed effectively." Elena examined the intelligence reports with her trained scientific eye, recognizing genetic sequences and research methodologies that bore the unmistakable signature of Viktor Markov's work. The new viral strains described in the documents were masterpieces of biological engineering, combining elements from multiple viral families with artificial genetic modifications that had never been seen in nature. The weapons were designed to be highly contagious, extremely lethal, and virtually impossible to treat with existing medical interventions. "The technical sophistication of these new bioweapons is beyond anything we've encountered before," Agent Chen continued. "Our best scientists at the CDC, USMRE, and other facilities have been studying the recovered samples for months, but they can't fully understand how the genetic modifications work or how to develop effective countermeasures. We believe that Viktor Markov's unique approach to viral genetics makes him nearly impossible for conventional researchers to track or predict." Elena realized that her inherited understanding of viral behavior, which she had always attributed to natural talent and hard work, might indeed be the product of genetic predisposition passed down from her father. The intuitive insights that had made her so successful in her CDC research might represent a way of thinking about biological systems that was fundamentally similar to Viktor Markov's approach, giving her potential advantages in understanding his work that no other scientist could possess. "Our intelligence suggests that Viktor Markov is planning to deploy these new biological weapons within the next 6 months," Agent Chen said, his voice carrying the weight of impending catastrophe. "We don't know his specific targets, his delivery methods, or his ultimate objectives, but we believe the attack could be unprecedented in its scope and lethality. Traditional intelligence gathering and law enforcement approaches have completely failed to locate him or penetrate his organization." Agent Chen explained that Viktor Markov had spent the 15 years since the 2009 outbreak building a sophisticated international network of supporters, laboratories, and delivery systems. He had apparently recruited scientists from multiple countries, established research facilities in remote locations around the world, and developed financial resources that allowed him to operate independently of any government or terrorist organization. His current operation was believed to be entirely self-sufficient and virtually impossible to infiltrate using conventional intelligence methods. "This is where you come in," Agent Chen said, looking directly at Elena with an expression that mixed hope and desperation. "Your genetic connection to Viktor Markov gives you unique insights into how he thinks and approaches biological research problems. Your scientific training makes you capable of understanding his work at a level that our best intelligence analysts can't achieve. And your personal relationship to him might provide opportunities for contact or communication that wouldn't be available to anyone else." Elena felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders as Agent Chen outlined what the government was asking her to do. The mission would require her to use her scientific expertise and genetic heritage to track down Viktor Markov, infiltrate his organization if possible, and gather intelligence that could be used to prevent the next biological weapons attack. The work would be extremely dangerous, requiring her to enter the shadowy world of international bioterrorism and potentially confront her father directly. "I want to be absolutely clear about what we're asking," Agent Chen said, his voice taking on a more formal tone that emphasized the gravity of the situation. "This wouldn't be a traditional intelligence operation where you're working undercover with backup and extraction plans. If Viktor Markov discovers that you're working against him, or if his organization identifies you as a security threat, you could be killed without any possibility of rescue or intervention by U.S. forces." Elena understood that accepting the mission would mean abandoning her quiet life as a CDC researcher and entering a world where her survival would depend on her ability to deceive some of the most dangerous people on Earth. She would be leaving behind the carefully constructed safety of her monitored existence and venturing into territory where the government's long-term surveillance and protection could no longer guarantee her security. But Elena also understood that refusing the mission might not be a viable option. As the daughter of the world's most wanted bioterrorist, she would always be seen as a potential security threat by intelligence agencies around the world. Her knowledge of classified CDC research and her genetic connection to Viktor Markov made her valuable as either an asset or a target, but not as a private citizen who could simply return to normal life. "What exactly would be expected of me?" Elena asked, trying to understand the practical details of what the government was proposing. "How would I make contact with Viktor Markov's organization? What kind of intelligence would you need me to gather? And what happens to me after the mission is completed, regardless of whether it succeeds or fails?" Agent Chen pulled out a thick briefing document that contained detailed operational plans, background intelligence, and risk assessments related to the proposed mission. The scope of the operation was staggering, involving multiple intelligence agencies, international cooperation agreements, and coordination with military forces around the world. Elena realized that her decision would affect not just her own life, but potentially the lives of millions of people who might become victims of Viktor Markov's next biological weapons attack. The mission would begin with intensive training in intelligence techniques, survival skills, and advanced biological weapons analysis, Agent Chen explained. "You would work with our best operatives to develop approaches for making contact with Viktor Markov's network, possibly by presenting yourself as a scientist interested in joining his research program. Your genetic heritage and scientific credentials would make you an attractive recruit for his organization. Elena felt a chill as she realized that the mission would require her to essentially become the kind of person her father would want to work with, a brilliant scientist willing to develop biological weapons for mass destruction. She would have to convince Viktor Markov and his associates that she shared their goals and values while secretly gathering intelligence that could be used to destroy everything they had built. The ultimate objective would be to locate Viktor Markov's primary research facilities, identify his key personnel and supporters, and gather enough intelligence to allow military forces to neutralize his biological weapons program before the next attack. Agent Chen continued, "If possible, we would also want you to gather samples of his research materials and data about his planned targets and delivery methods." Elena stared at the mission briefing documents, understanding that she was being asked to make a choice that would define the rest of her life and potentially determine the fate of millions of innocent people. She could accept the mission and risk everything to prevent another biological weapons catastrophe, or she could refuse and live with the knowledge that her decision might have contributed to one of the worst disasters in human history. The laboratory fell silent again as Elena weighed her options, knowing that whatever choice she made would be irreversible and would carry consequences that she could never fully anticipate or control. Agent Chen watched her carefully, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether their last hope for stopping Viktor Markov would choose to help save the world or protect herself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.